This evening, honestly, I'm not sure that we're going to get to our text today, but you remember last week we began to look at Romans chapter 14, and last week we talked about some of the myths surrounding Christmas. We talked about the myth that the day, December 25th, was chosen because it was to replace the pagan festival of Saturnalia or Solus Victus. And we talked about how that's not true at all. There's really no indication in the historical record that the reason why Christians began celebrating that day was because of those things. What was one of the main reasons?
That's funny. I just got listening on a radio Christian broadcast, and they came up with that excuse that it was replacing the.
That's what they say. That's what everybody says. You could, if you Google it, I read a real article by a respected historian, and they said the same thing, which is disappointing because that would cause one to lose respect for them. It's in the office. Yeah, all that's by the soundboard. Take your tablet and let's go. Go on, baby J. So what was one of the main reasons why that date was chosen? Does anyone remember?
Because it's the solstice, I know that. Between the 20th and the 22nd.
Okay, so that is right around the time of the winter solstice. Jesus may have been born in the winter. Yeah, that's possible. And what was one of the reasons why people think he may have been born?
Great man.
Yeah.
Their conception, birth, and their death were the same
day.
Yes, that's exactly right. So there's this idea, there's this kind of classical idea, there's this kind of ancient thought that certain great men have what they call the perfect life. And the perfect life is indicated in that one of these people, we're talking about people like Jesus, we're talking about people like Julius Caesar, like Alexander the Great, that these great men were conceived on the same day that they died. And so the idea is they dated Jesus' death to sometime around March 25th, which I guess they figured that was whatever the time was. But 9 months forward from March the 25th, which is not totally unrealistic, that's around Passover time. And 9 months from that day is December 25th. And so that's where the date December 25th came from. It didn't have anything to do with these festivals or anything like that. And in fact, we're going to talk a little bit about this tonight, but Christians were celebrating Christmas, the nativity, I should say, around this time of late December, early January, before celebrations of Solus Victus and all this stuff were even going on in the first place. So it didn't really have anything to do with that as much as it had to do with that idea of the perfect life. That's why that date was chosen. And we talked about some other myths. What were some of the other myths we talked about last week? Let's see. Oh, we talked about the idea that Jesus was just another Son Messiah. You know, the idea is that December 25th was picked because of all these astrological signs in the heavens, the star in the east followed by the three wise men, and the resurrection of the sun, S-U-N, all of these kinds of things. And we talked about how, just some of the issues that are found there. One being that whole idea of worshiping the resurrected Son, S-U-N, sounds a lot like, the resurrected Son, like S-O-N. In English, it sounds like that, but in Greek and in Latin, that doesn't even work because they're totally different words. So that little play on words would not make sense in the ancient languages in which Christianity developed. It makes a little bit of sense in English, but there would have been no confusion in Greek or in Latin about whether it was the Son or whether it was the Son. There would have been no confusion about that. And another myth that we busted was just the idea that Christmas is pagan. So there's just this generalized take that Christmas is bad because it's pagan. You know, the pagans did the Yule logs and the trees and the houses and the lights and the candies and the gifts and all that stuff. And the point that I raised to that was simply, you know what else pagans did? Pagans like got married and had children. And pagans took care of their families and took care and educated their kids. And pagans do all kinds of things. Pagans are the ones who invented wedding rings. And so we wear wedding rings. Does that mean we're pagans, right? This whole idea, just because a pagan did something and Christians may do a similar thing for a totally different reason, does not mean that that thing is inherently pagan. What makes something pagan is the reason why you do it. What makes something Christian is the reason that you do it. And that's what we talked about in the text in Romans 14. It said, the one who treats one day above another is doing so unto the Lord. And the one who considers all days the same is doing so unto the Lord. And so whether you celebrate or don't celebrate, either way, it's unto the Lord. And so we shouldn't judge one another on that basis. Well, that was a little bit of myth busting we did last week. Today I want to give a brief history of Christmas.
Can I ask you,
Go ahead.
when was the Christmas? I know it hasn't always been celebrated, especially maybe Christ's birth has been celebrated not on December 25th, but when did that start? I heard it was like 1600s. What was your?
We're going to talk about that. So we're going to get into that this evening as we look at a brief history of Christmas. We talked about some myths. Now let's look at the history of Christmas. So the first one, let's talk about, first of all, where does the term Christmas even come from? Now, we all know this one. Where does the term Christmas come from?
Christ Mass.
It is the Christ Mass, right? Which is basically true. It is basically true. The term Christmas comes from the Old English term, how do we say it? It's the Old English term Christis Macy. The Christis Macy, which is the Mass of Christ. Okay, and that was a term that was first used. The first instance we have recorded of that is in the year 1038 AD. Christus Macy. And this is an Old English word. In the Dutch language, the term for Christmas is the term Kerstmis. 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 Kerstmis in Dutch. And so this is where the term Christmas comes from. It's the Mass of Christ, the Christ Mass. And of course, English is the only language that we call it Christmas. It's called different things in different languages, but the term Christmas comes from the Christis Macies, or the Mass of Christ. Now, let's start talking about the actual history of Christmas, right? Now, the earliest Christians, as we know, did not celebrate Christmas. First of all, they did not celebrate the birth of Christ in any capacity at all. And to the degree that they did, they didn't call it Christmas, right? So it wasn't known as Christmas until much later in the High Middle Ages. 1038 AD is the first time we see that recorded in writing. But the earliest Christians did not celebrate the birth of Christ. In fact, the earliest Christians ridiculed the pagans for observing the birth of their gods and their great men. So the earliest Christians said, we don't do that. That's something these weirdo pagans do. This is not something that we do. Now, when they did begin to celebrate Christ's birth, it wasn't called Christmas, of course. They were calling it the Nativity. So the earliest Christian, and if you read through church history and you read what these people say, you're not going to find the word Christmas. You're going to find the celebration of the Nativity, the feast of the Nativity. And the Nativity, of course, is simply the birth of Christ. We know that the nativity scene where you've got Jesus in the manger and the animals and the shepherds and the goats and everything, that's a nativity. The nativity refers to the birth of Christ. So the earliest reference to the celebration of the nativity comes from a guy by the name of Clement of Alexandria, and this was around the year 200 AD. So 200 AD, you can do the math, that's about 170 years after the life of Jesus. And in his writings is the first instance we see of people who are observing or celebrating the nativity of Christ. And it all started in Egypt. So Clement of Alexandria, of course, lived in Alexandria of Egypt. And he writes in his thing that at this time, there were some Egyptian theologians, and you know how theologians can be. They began to speculate. And these Egyptian theologians were speculating about the exact time that Christ may have been born. And there was, of course, many different guesses. Some of them guessed March 28th, and some of them sometime in April, and some of them sometime in May. And it's like we said last time, if you look throughout the sources, you will find there is a guess on the month that Jesus was born for every single month out of the year. And so this started way back in the 200s. People were speculating about when Jesus may have been born. But Clement of Alexandria mentions something in his letter. He mentions something here in this document, and he talks about this certain group in Egypt. And they began, he notes, they were celebrating what is called the Epiphany. Okay? And they were celebrating the Feast of the Epiphany and the Feast of the Nativity, both around January 6th. So the earliest reference to the celebration of the Nativity was not December 25th, it was January the 6th. And it was connected to the Feast of the Epiphany. Now, does anybody know what that refers to? What is the Epiphany of Christ?
Isn't that the Maccabees?
It's not the Maccabees, no. That's connected to like Hanukkah.
Right.
The Maccabees and that's all connected.
Thought the Epiphany.
No, so the Epiphany, and this is a feast that is celebrated by Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox to this very day. The Feast of the Epiphany refers to three things: Jesus' baptism, the visit of the Magi, and the wedding at Cana. So the wedding at Cana, Jesus' baptism, and the visit of the Magi. And the whole idea is all three of these events happened on the same day, which was the day that Jesus was born. So the idea was that Jesus was baptized on the same day that he was born. And of course, it's because in the scripture it says when he was about 30 years old, that's when he was baptized and began his ministry. And so people took that and said, well, he must have been 30. It was his 30th birthday. So the idea is that he was baptized on the same day that he was born. The idea also is that around this same time is when the Magi came and they worshiped him with gifts. And this was the same time that he revealed his glory in the miracle at the wedding of Cana. And so the idea of the Epiphany is the revelation of the glory of God. It's like when we have an epiphany, we realize something. It's like, oh, this is clear now. Well, between Jesus' baptism, where the heavenly voice came and said, this is my son in whom I'm well pleased, and between his miracle at the wedding of Cana, and between the wise men coming with gifts for this great king, this was the epiphany to the world that Christ the King had been born. So this was actually the earliest indication of the celebration of the Nativity. The Nativity wasn't even the central part. It really had to do with this epiphany, this realization that Christ is God. It just so happens that the idea was that all these things happened on the same day he was born. And so they were connected. Does that make sense? You guys look confused when I say that.
I'm not confused. The wise men didn't show up till about years after he was born.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a time delay. Yeah.
I thought the word epiphany came from Epiphany, Antioch Epiphanes. I thought he was the one who led the rebellion in Maccabees, and that's where we get the term "I've had an epiphany." He realized that he was God, and he went in and slaughtered the pig.
Yeah, the term epiphany is like, it's like a lighting up. It's like a revelation. It's like a ding. This makes sense now, and that it is a Greek word, but what it means is like to come to understand. And it's used in connection to, like I say, Christ's baptism, the Magi, and the miracle at the wedding of Cana. And the idea is this is when Christ revealed, when people began to realize who he was. The Feast of the Epiphany. You can look that up if you're more interested in that. And this is a thing that to this day is celebrated on January the 6th. And as we mentioned before, Christmas is celebrated, particularly in the West, on December the 25th. And the 12 days in between Christmas and the Feast of the Epiphany are the 12 days of Christmas. So that's where that comes from. And it just so happens churches in the East still to this day celebrate the Nativity on January 6th. So they're still celebrated together. Okay? Right. But the earliest mention of the celebration of Christ's birth comes from Clement of Alexandria about 200 AD, and it's in connection with this feast of the Epiphany. Now, going on from there, what we actually see is that in AD 354, so this is about 150 years later, we see from a Roman civic calendar. So this is just like a calendar that would have been distributed or posted somewhere in Rome. It had all the holidays, had all the important events. A Roman civic calendar in the year 354 AD has on December 25th listed the Nativity of Christ. The Nativity of Christ is listed in 354 AD on December 25th on a Roman civic calendar. And so if it was on the calendar, it had obviously been being practiced before then. But by this time, by the time you get to 354, we see that it had made it onto the Roman calendar. Now, why should we not be surprised that in the 300s, Christianity began to spread in popularity and it began to be seen? Why should we not be surprised that we see this kind of thing in Rome around 350? What happened in the 300s that would allow for this sort of thing to happen?
Constantine.
Okay, and tell me about that.
Yeah, there was a battle of Melville where he seen a cross appear. He had an epiphany.
He had an epiphany, yeah.
And he would win the battle. I can't remember exactly. I'm just giving you. And they did. After that, plus his mother was supposed to have been a Christian.
Okay.
And that's when everything started.
So Constantine converted to Christianity. And why was that significant? What was happening to Christians prior to that?
Human candles.
Yeah, they were being slaughtered. They were used as human candles. They were fed to animals in the Colosseum. In fact, the most fierce period of Christian persecution in the Roman Empire took place in the early 300s. So the most fierce persecution was happening right up until the time that Constantine was converted to Christianity. And when Constantine converted to Christianity, what happened? The persecution ended. It ended. Of course, if the emperor is a Christian now, he's not going to continue to kill Christians, right? So Constantine became a Christian and ended the persecution of Christianity. Now, he did not make Christianity the state religion. He simply made it a legal religion. Prior to this, it had been illegal to be a Christian. Constantine's converted, and now Christianity is legal. So at this point, this is when we see a lot of development kind of in change in the culture of the church. Because we see prior to this, it would have been very difficult for Christians to have a building where they gathered together regularly, because the soldiers would just come in and kill everybody, right? So, but now that it's legal, now you begin to see church buildings popping up. Now that it's legal, we really begin to see the distribution of professional scribes and manuscripts, and that thing starts going out because it's no longer illegal to possess the scriptures. Now that Constantine has made it legal to be a Christian, we begin to see Christianity taking greater and greater influence. Of course, if the emperor is a Christian, that's going to have some pretty profound effects, both positively and negatively, right? So not only it's good that Christians aren't being persecuted anymore, but what begins to happen over the course of time is you get this nominal Christianity, where it's like, okay, well, I'm born in Rome, and Rome is a Christian empire. I guess I'm a Christian, but really that's not how Christianity works, right? And this is a problem that we see all the way through the Middle Ages, even to this very day. Nominal Christianity is a real problem, and a lot of that really did begin with Constantine, his conversion, and when eventually, this would happen after Constantine's death, but eventually Christianity is made the official religion of the Roman Empire. Now that took place later. Constantine did not do that. A different emperor did that later down
What was
the line.
Council of Nicaea?
That was in 325 AD, which was 12 years after Constantine's conversion. And Constantine resided at the Council of Nicaea. Now, he wasn't a decision maker, but he is the one who kind of put it together and gathered all the bishops together and sponsored it, basically. Paid people's traveling expenses, paid for them to be put up in the town. The empire sponsored the Council of Nicaea, but that does not mean that he had any input as to decisions or decrees that were made there. That didn't happen. And we can talk more about Constantine one day, maybe. But it is important to know that in the 300s, that did happen. And it fundamentally changed what Christianity would do over the course of the next 1,000+ years. This was a very important thing. Now, that being said, so in the early 300s, we see that this festival was being celebrated in December 25th in Rome. But over the rest of the 300s, if you look at the historical data, you see that different regions in the world were celebrating the Nativity and trying to kind of figure out when they were going to celebrate it. And what you basically had was some regions celebrated it in December the 25th, while some regions were celebrating it in January, around January the 6th. And basically speaking, that fell into a Western versus an Eastern idea. For example, Rome obviously celebrated it December 25th, while in Jerusalem, the Nativity of Christ was always celebrated in January. There's no indication they celebrated December 25th, always in January. And those are just two examples of this East-West divide of when these things were being celebrated. Now, that being said, as the church spread throughout pagan Europe, more and more people in Europe, the Germans and the Britons and the French and all these people, they began to adopt these nativity celebrations as the church influence spread throughout Europe. So that by the time you get to the High Middle Ages, around 1000, 1100 AD, by the time we get to what we call the High Middle Ages, pretty much all of Europe had been Christianized. And all of Europe was observing the liturgical calendar, the church calendar, if you will, which included Christmas. It included Easter. It includes these different feasts and holidays and everything. So by the time you get to 1100 AD, Christmas is now being celebrated all throughout Europe. Does that make sense? Now, at that time, during this whole time, from the earliest days all the way up to the High Middle Ages, really, and this doesn't change until we get to the Reformation, and we'll talk about this, what you have in the celebration of Christmas is nothing like it's not how we celebrate it. The celebration of Christmas is what we would call liturgical. And liturgy is simply public worship. So when we say liturgical, we're talking about religious, basically. The celebration of Christmas was all centered around Mass. It was all centered around processions. It was all centered around prayers. It was all centered around feasts and all these different things. It was very liturgical. The singing of hymns and carols within the church. This was a part of the celebration of Christmas. The celebration of Christmas was a religious holiday. And that's how it was, as I say, all the way up through the Middle Ages. And it was at this time that we begin to see some of the traditions that we still know today, such as Christmas carols. So many of the English Christmas carols don't come until much later, but the concept of singing Christmas carols at Christmas time, it really came into practice around this time in the Middle Ages. Another one that came into practice in the Middle Ages is the nativity scene itself. Our neighbors over here, they have a nativity scene in their front yard with the manger and the animals and the wise men and the shepherds. That was a thing that came into practice in the 1200s. That came into practice in the 1200s. It was developed and it began to be displayed in churches at that time. And as time would go on, and we'll see, people eventually began bringing those into their homes. Does anybody have a nativity set in their home? Does anyone use those? I have one. Yeah, so lots of us do. That was a practice that began in the High Middle Ages. Okay? That's a Christmas tradition going all the way back to the liturgical kind of high church celebration of Christmas in the Middle Ages. So, now that being said, that kind of leads us into this next part, which is the decline of Christmas. So at that point, when we're in the high Middle Ages there, Christmas is at its peak. It's being celebrated all throughout Europe, all throughout the Middle East. Of course, there's a lot to say about that, and the Muslims had something to say about that. But in Europe, anyway, this is like the peak of liturgical Christmas time, and everything was really great. But that all changed once we get into the Reformation. The Reformation. So the Reformation begins in the early 1500s, and at this time, you really have a breakup. Because prior to this, in Europe, basically the Catholic Church dominated there was really only that one religious institution. So everybody, if you were a Christian, you were a Roman Catholic for over 1,000 years. That's just the way that it worked. And during the Reformation, that began to split apart. And when you mix the politics and the religion with it, what you end up with is Catholic states, such as France and Spain and Italy and others, and Protestant states, such as England and Germany and the Deutschlands and Scotland and these different places, right? So you have this political breakup of Protestant and Catholic states, basically, around the time of the Reformation. And the Catholic states continued business as usual. So the traditions of the High Middle Ages continue on in there. But in the Protestant states, things began to change. Because as they separated themselves from other aspects of Rome, one of the things that they separated themselves from was the celebration of Christmas. And so what would happen is these Protestant states would say, listen, we no longer observe these feast days and this is not a part of our liturgical year anymore. And while that may have been the case politically, the people, the individuals in society, who had grown up generation after generation with these traditions at this time, they would continue the traditions. They would continue the feasting and the merrymaking and the gift giving and some of the things that were associated with Christmas. Those things continued while the Mass and the carols and the processions, those things began to fell away. So during the Reformation, Christmas went from being a very liturgical, very public, very communal holiday, and it began to be a more private holiday. It began to be more separated from the religious aspects of it, and it began to really just be more of like a winter festival kind of holiday. This began during the Reformation, as there was a divorce between the holiday of Christmas and the Roman Catholic Church and the liturgical calendar. And this was most pronounced in Scotland and in England. So early in the 1500s, Scotland completely outlawed the celebration of Christmas. Like if you wanted to celebrate Christmas in Scotland, you were risking your life because it was illegal. And in England, there was a group of people known as the Puritans. And the Puritans also despised Christmas. They did not want anybody to celebrate Christmas. And when they got into power in the mid-1600s, they also outlawed the celebration of Christmas in England. So these were like the two up there in the British Isles. They wanted nothing to do. They tried to stamp out Christmas altogether. Of course, that was unsuccessful. They were not successful in their efforts because, as I say, people continued to hold to the traditions. They continued to hold to the festivities and the merrymaking and the gift giving. Even though it wasn't a liturgical practice, it lost a lot of its religious significance, but people were still celebrating the festivities that were associated with it. And this actually really leads me to the next point, which is Christmas in America. So that was like an overview of how everything Christmas related from the earliest times up through the Reformation. Now let's talk about Christmas in America, because there are some distinct Christmas things in America. What are some of them?
Gift giving.
Gift giving. What else? What do you do for Christmas? What did your grandparents do for Christmas?
Decorate a Christmas tree.
Decorate a Christmas tree.
Gather together to eat.
Family feasting.
I became Grinch.
What's that?
I turned into a Grinch.
She turned into the Grinch. So the Grinch, yeah, the Grinch is a distinctly American thing as well. I like the Grinch. The Grinch is pretty cool. Anything else? Santa Claus. Yes, Santa Claus is a distinctly American thing.
North Pole and the Elves.
The North Pole and the elves and all that's associated with Santa Claus, right? So where did all of this come from? Like, where did this stuff come? Because we've talked about the celebration of the Nativity from 200 AD up into the 15 and 1600s, and we have not said even a whit about any of that, have we? Because none of that existed. None of that was there. That was never a part of the celebration of Christmas. So where did that stuff come from? That's what we're fixing to talk about right now. So as I said, I repeat myself. The High Middle Ages, Christmas was a liturgical and communal holiday. It was celebrated not as individual families, but as a community, and it was celebrated particularly in the church. It was a church holiday. And it was observed with frequent masses, processions, feastings, and carols. Now, by the time you get to the Reformation, the focus was taken off of the liturgical or the religious aspects of the celebration, and people maintained many of the old traditions, and sometimes they had to do it in the privacy of their own home in certain cases where it was illegal. Okay? So then we get to America. Now, who were the main people to settle America, particularly in the New England colonies? The Puritans. And what did the Puritans think about Christmas? They did not like it. So when you get to America, particularly in the New England colonies, Christmas was not celebrated. Christmas was not observed. Christmas was not a thing. In fact, Christmas was illegal to celebrate in the state of Massachusetts, or in the colony, I should say, of Massachusetts, even up into the late 1600s. And it was strongly discouraged by the state of Massachusetts all the way into the 1800s. In fact, in Massachusetts, particularly in Boston, what a lot of people would do is on Christmas Day, say Christmas was on a Tuesday, which is a work day, they wouldn't give anybody the day off. In fact, they would start work at 5 o'clock in the morning so that people could not go to church that morning. And if they showed up late, they would be fired. And the schools would stay open on Christmas Day. And if any kids missed school or were late to school, that kid would be expelled from the school because they were discouraging people from celebrating Christmas in Massachusetts. They did not want that to be celebrated. And that was the reality all the way into the mid to late 1800s in the New England colonies, particularly in Massachusetts. It was discouraged. And that's because of, once again, the Puritan influence. But the Puritans were not the only people who made colonies in the Americas. You had the French were in the north, right? They were in Quebec and even some of what would become northern states. You had the Spanish in the south, Florida and Louisiana and some different places like that. And both of these were Catholic states. And so as they came to the New World, they brought with them their Catholic traditions surrounding Christmas. But it was in the middle. It was in these British English colonies, this particularly New England, where you see this eschewing, you could say, this pushing away of Christmas. They did not want to celebrate Christmas. And this will become an important thing to know. Now, prior to the mid-1800s, so all the way from 1619 all the way up until the mid-1800s, Christmas celebrations in America were local and they were not very popular. So you might have a region that celebrated Christmas with like a parade or a festival or a feast or something, and then there was another region that didn't. But overall, Christmas was just not a part of the spirit of the nation. Christmas wasn't a thing that was very popular in the United States. It was popular in the Catholic areas. It was popular in a few areas like that. But for the most part, nobody cared about Christmas all the way into the mid-1800s. It just wasn't a thing. Now, that all began to change around the time of the Civil War and immediately thereafter. What are your ideas? Why did that begin to change around the time of the Civil War? What was happening that may have changed that? Don't everybody answer at once. Well, here's the thing about this. So in the Civil War, you've got this boy from Texas, and he's called up to fight in the army. And you've got this boy from, Maine, who's called to fight in the army. And there's not a lot of fight going on in Texas, and there's not a lot of fight going on in Maine, but there is a bunch of fight going on in Virginia. So you got to take this boy from Texas and get him up to Virginia. and you got to take this boy from Maine and get him down to Virginia. Well, in the process of that, they're traveling through and they're experiencing the customs and the practices of different peoples in different regions. So as during the Civil War, with just the basic movement of people began to experience different cultures in the United States. And some people went through places where they celebrated Christmas and they thought, hey, this is kind of neat. This is kind of cool. And at the end of the war, some of those traditions made their way from point A back to point B and from point C over to point D. And there was just a dispersion, you could say, of culture because of the movement of people. And another reason is after the Civil War, there was a huge influx of immigrants. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, lots and lots and lots of immigrants, particularly the Irish and the German, began to come over from Europe into America. And they brought with them their old world Christmas customs. They brought them into America. So you have this flow of people experiencing different cultures, being exposed to different practices, and then you have this pouring in of people from the old world, bringing with them their old practices. And when we put these together, what we see is the rise in popularity of Christmas. Now, it is in the second half of the 1800s that many of our most popular Christmas traditions begin to take root. So this is where we get to it. Where did the Christmas tree come from? Where did Santa Claus come from? Where did decorating the outsides of our homes and setting up nativity sets and all of these things, where did all this come from? Because, Gregory of Nyssa or whatever, all these church history people back in the Middle Ages, they were not lighting Christmas trees and exchanging gifts and cookies. This was not a thing that was going on. That's not how they celebrated Christmas, right? Back in the 1600s, you didn't have these people sitting around lighting up candy canes and putting lights on the outside of their house with all their stuff. So that's not what was had. They did not celebrate Christmas that way. Where did all this come from? Let's talk about the Christmas tree first of all. So the Christmas tree originated in Germany in the 1790s. The very first example of a Christmas tree, it's a German thing, and it first started happening in the 1790s. They would bring a evergreen tree into their home, and they would decorate it. They would put ornaments and stuff on it. They would put candles on it to light it, And this was Christmas trees. This is where that came from. It was a German practice that started in the late 1700s. In fact, the first written explanation of what a Christmas tree looked like came in 1816, and it came from a German poet. He published the first description of a Christmas tree in his work, The Nutcracker and the Mouse King. The Nutcracker and the Mouse King, 1816. This is a German thing, and it describes for the first time this kind of Christmas tree, which was a relatively new practice. It was a new invention at that time, and we still consider the Nutcracker like a central Christmas thing to this day, right? 1816 is when that was produced. The Christmas tree and personal gift giving, this really marked the beginning of a change in Christmas. Because prior to this, as I said, Christmas had been public, it had been communal, it had been liturgical. In America, it was really not even celebrated by most people. It wasn't that popular. But once you bring in the Christmas tree, everything starts to shift from community and church onto private and family. This is where you get the exchanging of gifts between family members. This is where you get everyone, it's taking out from the streets and into the home. This is where Christmas really begins to become a private holiday, a family holiday. This is in the mid to late 1800s. Now, let's talk about Santa Claus for a moment. Santa Claus. The very first depiction of Santa Claus came in a newspaper. It was illustrated in a newspaper in January of 1863, right in the heart of the Civil War. And it was a picture of Santa Claus visiting the Union troops on Christmas Day of 1862. And Santa Claus was an illustration and a creation, and it was drawn up by a German cartoonist. So the Christmas tree came from Germany. Santa Claus also came from Germany. It was written up, it was designed by a German cartoonist, and his name was Thomas Nast. Now, as time would go on, Thomas Nast would develop this character, and in 1866, he put out a work called Santa Claus and His Works. You can look this up, 1866. Santa Claus and His Works. And this was like a pamphlet telling all the lore of Santa Claus, right? About him living in the North Pole and riding a sleigh that is drawn by reindeer, and how he makes a list and checks it twice, and how he's keeping tabs on how well behaved the kids are being. All of this came about Thomas Nast and the character that he created in America in the year 1863, and in his work in 1866, all of the Santa Claus lore starts to come out. All the things we know about him today date back to 1866. Even so, Santa Claus did not really become popular until the early 1900s, when a little song came out by the name of Santa Claus is Coming to Town. This was a song written and produced in 1934. And this song became so popular, it was like the #1 Billboard hit at the time. And it sold, back then you marked how successful a song was by how much sheet music it sold. So people wanting to buy the sheet music to learn how to play it. And it was the highest selling, most popular song in that time. And it wasn't until the early 1900s, 1934 and beyond, that Santa Claus really became like a national American figure. So he was developed in 1863, and he became big time in the 1930s. What about the nativities and decorating the outsides of our houses? Just like, and our neighbors here are the perfect example, because they're decorating the outside of their house with a nativity. So this is the perfect example. When did that kind of thing start? When did people start decorating their homes and setting this stuff up? Well, that also began in the early 1900s, as the Irish immigrants came in, particularly to New England and to some of those northern states. The Irish would come and they would set up and they would decorate their windows. And they had nativity sets inside their houses. And as the New Englanders, who didn't really celebrate Christmas that often, as they were looking around, they said, hey, that's kind of cute. That's kind of cool. I like that. And it just really began to spread from there. But it was Irish immigrants who brought those customs over. And it just became so popular, particularly in New England, that now to this day, it is a mainstay of the way that we celebrate Christmas. So it was in 1870 that Ulysses S. Grant signed the law into place that declared Christmas to be a federal holiday. Prior to 1870, Christmas was not even a holiday in the United States. And it was Ulysses S. Grant in 1870 that made it a federal holiday. But once again, it still wasn't until even decades later that it became what it is today. And it didn't really become what it is today until even much further beyond that. You're talking the 50s, 60s, 70s. Really the 50s, kind of like Halloween, where it became like a commercial holiday around the 50s. And there's historical reasons for that too. But that's when Christmas really became what it is today. But so we see that throughout much of American history, Christmas wasn't even a big deal. And it wasn't until the time of the Civil War and immediately thereafter that it became very popular. And it really wasn't until the last 70 years that it became what it is now. I think everybody knows what I mean when I say what it is now. That really didn't start happening until even later in the 1950s. So I just had a few interesting takeaways that I wanted to share with you, and then I'd like to hear any more thoughts you have about this. I know this was more of like a history lesson than a Bible study, and some people really don't like that, and I really do apologize. I understand the frustration, but I hope that this is at least interesting and that we're learning something. And I think that it's good to examine. I'll be honest with you, I learned a lot as I was even preparing all of this. I learned a lot, and I hope that some of it came across clearly. Here's an interesting takeaway I have. In the United States of America, we often complain about how people are taking Christ out of Christmas and how it's so commercial and it's like nobody even cares about Jesus. And I realize in all of this that Christmas has never been a celebration of Christ's nativity in America. That's never been what it's about. Not here, not in our culture. The way that we celebrate Christmas has never had anything to do with Jesus. Is that not so? That's a very interesting thing for me. Never again will you hear me say that in America we're taking Christ out of Christmas. Christ was really never even in Christmas for us. The things that really blew up Christmas culture in America was Santa Claus and the Christmas tree. And neither one of those have anything to do with Christ. Christmas was never even really celebrated in America. From the very beginning, it wasn't even celebrated. And so, really, it's not a matter of Christ being taken out of Christmas, but it's really a matter of Christians trying to inject Christ back into Christmas, is really what the fight is. The fight is really Christians trying to inject Christ into our celebrations of Christmas, and which is not a problem, admittedly, that the Catholic Church has because they have a different history. So, in that sense, they're at a bit of an advantage. Another interesting takeaway I had is that most of our famous and beloved Christmas traditions, A, they have nothing to do with Christ, as I said. They have nothing to do with him at all whatsoever. And B, is that the way that we celebrate Christmas is really only 150 years old at the most. And it has nothing to do with the ancient practice of Christmas. It has nothing to do with the way that Christmas was celebrated in the Middle Ages. The way that we celebrate it here it's so divorced from what it was in times past. It's bizarre. It's really a different holiday altogether. I mean, it really is. Basically, what we did in our culture was take the day where Christmas had been celebrated in ancient times, and we just it's the opposite of what people accuse Christians of doing. People say that Christians took Christmas and put it on top of a pagan holiday to make it Christian. But really, that's not what happened. And what has happened in our time is we took a Christian holiday and slapped our pagan festivals on top of it. So we took a Christian holiday and turned it into a pagan holiday, is what really happened. And so the challenge for us as believers is not stop taking Christ out of Christmas, especially as Protestant believers, as people who are not a part of the Roman Catholic Church. Our challenge is, how can we take this holiday, Christmas, and really focus it in on Christ? How can we glean from the way that it was celebrated in the past, take that and kind of inject it into the way that Christmas is celebrated today? And is there anything wrong with following the cultural celebrations of Christmas? I don't think so. I do a lot of this stuff, different things, and it's up to individual families to decide how they celebrate the holiday or if they celebrate it at all. But I don't think there's anything wrong with participating in a cultural celebration. The challenge we have as believers is taking that day and celebrating it unto God. The challenge that we have is taking this season and setting it apart as holy unto God. Because, if we're just going along with the culture and the celebration and doing all that and calling it Christmas, well, that's not very useful. That's not a holiday. That's not a holy day unto God. So the challenge that we have, and the challenge that I personally have, is how can we take this season, how can we take this holiday, which has been co-opted by the pagans, right? It's the opposite of what people accuse Christians of doing. It's been co-opted. Now, as a Christian and for my family, how do I inject Christ into all of this? How can I do it? And there are many different ways and methods and means of doing that. And that's something that we all have to think about, and maybe we could talk about at another day. But that is my brief history of Christmas. Any questions or comments or thoughts or anything? I know I did a lot of talking, but I'd like to hear from you for a few moments here.
I thought it was interesting.
You did one of those things to everybody's dreams of Christmas.
Yeah, I hope not.
I look at it this way. The Bible's not specific, so if the Bible gave us a particular date, then it would be very important for us. But it does get into, the importance of it by describing so many different things, where Jesus is birth. And how important is Jesus' birth compared to his death, burial, and resurrection? So and telling us how the conception also happened, so it's one of those things, since it wasn't a particular day, it is important to celebrate it, but the time isn't so important. In other words, keep it in your heart all year round.
Yeah.
And to do it the Christian way.
Yeah. Yeah, we should celebrate the incarnation every day, right? Because without that, I mean, we would be dead in our
Whatever
sins.
you do, do it unto the Lord. That's
Yeah.
my theory on it.
Yeah, absolutely.
The most
Absolutely.
important thing is that he came to this earth to live among us. That's why it's so important. If we choose to sever or we choose to lie.
Well, Satan, he attacks different things. He attacks virgin birth,
Mm-hmm.
tries to say that didn't happen. And what's that? Da Vinci Code or whatever. That's all about doing away with the virgin birth. And, if you chip away at one, you're chipping away at everything.
Yeah, affairs with Mary Magdalene, Albert Children,
Right.
Rosicrucian.
And I never did read it. My brother did. It was very interesting. I said it was very interesting and wrong.
Yeah.
I don't have to read it to know that.
Yeah.
But, and we just have to be on guard. I would say be careful, but we're supposed to be careful for nothing. We're supposed to do everything unto the Lord. And that's just like everything else. It's been, Christmas has been so commercialized, everything. A long time ago, when I didn't get a present that I wanted, I got really mad. And I actually got the present, but it's my brother that did one of them little tricks. But ever since then, that presents don't matter to me. No, it was one of them flying airplanes. He gave me a box of bricks. Anyway, that's a lot. But I think I flew that thing twice before I wrapped it around my head.
Yeah, back then that was a remote control wire on the.
The string around.
That was such a.
And that blade going around 100 miles an
Oh,
hour.
yeah. One of those safety back
It'll
then.
give you a haircut.
Safety would wear a helmet.
But anyway, that's my Christmas. Presents don't matter.
Well,
My wife gets mad at me. She says, "You don't ever get excited about presents."
There's always-
Was Jesus when the wise men showed up?
Some people say that it happened right away, right? But he was definitely between 0 days and 2 years at some point. And like I said, we can't exactly know.
It says infant, and then it says they came to a child.
Yeah.
And there's a difference between an infant and a child.
Well, and when the wise men arrived, and the reason why a lot of people would say roughly 2 years or so is because
Herod killed everybody from 0 to 2 years.
exactly, the wise men came to Herod, and Herod said, "Oh yeah, tell me more about this." And then he ordered, "Well, go to Bethlehem and kill every child under 2 years old." Hey, when did that star appear exactly? Oh, 2 years ago? Okay, yeah, kill all the 2-year-olds and under. And so, it could have been any time between he was born and up to 2 years. And honestly, I mean, we don't know for sure. Yeah, but it's sometime he was definitely a young child. And so I definitely don't think it was, 12 days later or whatever. I don't think it was the same day he was born. But then again, nobody really knows. It was sometime in that 2-year span, because it's also possible that they saw the star and they started their traveling 2 years before Jesus was born. And so that they would have got there right at the time he was born, right thereabout. That's also a possible way. It's just as possible as the star appeared when he was born and then they started traveling. So it was sometime between 0 and 2. Sometime in there, yeah.
No, on the nativity set, you always put the shepherds closer and the magi are out here. They came later.
There you go. I didn't know there was a method to the madness. I just set it up.
They're first.
Oh.
Imagine, took a little while to get there, so they're out here.
Oh, yeah,
You
see.
can move them up after Christmas, move them up farther.
Maybe I should have Googled my thing before I started setting it up because I just put them wherever the kids put them, actually.
Besides gifts, did the kings warn them what they're doing?
I'm trying to remember in the story. I don't think they warned anybody, but they didn't go back to the king because Herod said, "Hey, find out where he is and come back and tell me." And they were warned of an angel, I think is how it went, and so they left.
Well, it also says that the shepherd came to the manger and the magi came to a house.
Yeah. So there's definitely a difference there. The shepherds and the angels definitely happened the night he was born. Babe wrapped in swaddling clothes, like he had just been born and was wrapped up in clothes and in the manger, and the angels were pronouncing his birth. So that happened same day for sure. And like I say, I don't think that the wise men came that same day. It was sometime later, but as to when later, nobody really
That's why
knows.
he was born in the spring, because the angels came to them, as the shepherds were in the field. They're only in the field in the spring, but they're also in the fall. So some people say it's actually around October. Major consensus is spring, late spring.
But at the same time, the climate in Jerusalem and in Israel is like the climate in Arizona. So it's not exactly 30 degrees in Phoenix in December, is it? So, you
It
know.
had been 30, well, in the morning.
Yeah.
It's warmed up pretty nice here.
Any other thoughts or comments?
Yes.
Kept you a little late here. I'm gonna blame that. I'm blaming this one on you because you guys had the thoughts in the comments that kept us late. Thanks, guys. No, I'm teasing.
Well, I'm not wrapping my head around the concept of the way that they celebrated the nativity before. So, I mean, obviously everybody has like their family traditions and stuff like that. So like, what did that look like?
So basically, this really continues on today. Like on the day of Christmas, there are 3 separate mass services. The first one is at midnight on Christmas Eve. So midnight on Christmas Day, it's midnight, December the 25th. That's the first one. And then there's another one in the morning and another one in the evening. So there's several masses. There was called a procession, and that would be where the priest and the deacon and all the different religious leaders, they lead like the host, which would be like the bread and the wine of communion. And it's like this big ordeal. This would be the Christmas morning mass where they lead it in and they sing the Christmas carols, and it's just a big feast day. And it's work is banned on that day. It's a holiday, so it's a sacred day. But it was observed with 3 masses on Christmas. There was a big procession. There was the singing of carols and Christmas hymns. Oftentimes, especially later, there would be a reenactment of the nativity story. So, where the kids would come and they would be like a Christmas play that would happen on Christmas Day as a thing. But it also was the beginning of Christmas Tide, which is the 12-day celebration leading up to the Feast of the Epiphany as well. So that whole 2 weeks, it was just marked by religious services and prayers and singing and the procession of communion, basically, and just those kinds of things. Does that clear that up at all?
Yeah,
It
so
was-
it's very similar to the way that the Catholics still celebrate Christmas
Yeah.
today.
Yeah.
And so they celebrated for 12 days. That wasn't just a one-day thing.
Yeah, and of course, it was Christmas Day on the 25th was like the big one, and then January 6th, the Feast of the Epiphany, was the big one, and then in between was it's like a holy season, but it's not celebrated with the same fervor.
Advent,
Yeah,
that's what it's called.
yeah, and Advent developed later. Advent begins on, I think, the first Sunday of December, I think, or 3 Sunday. Yeah, I think. Yeah. I think 3 Sundays before Christmas or something, Advent starts. I'm not sure exactly how that works because I don't do any of that. But yeah, so that's all part of it. And that's basically the Roman Catholic Church today has maintained. It's basically the same as it would have been. But it was also, like I say, back in the day, it was more communal. So, like, the Christmas celebration was less in the home with the family, and it was more in the street with the community, with parades and with feasts and with public gift giving and exchanging of baked goods and stuff. It was much more of a public celebration than a private celebration, and that's changed since the 1800s in America.
I'm not sure what site you got all your information, but All Builders is an excellent site. William Fetter, you might have heard of him. He's an expert on, especially when it has to do with America, but all history.
Yeah.
From a Christian perspective too.
Yeah, there's lots of different places to get lots of information on there. Wall Builders is a good one. All right. And any last questions before we go? That was a good question. I know that we're getting late here. I apologize for that. All right. Brother Bill, will you close us in prayer?